Parasite-resistant sheep. Today we're going to look at a scientific study comparing the St. Croix, Katahdin, and Dorper sheep breeds. Today, chemical dewormers are starting to fail due to something called ant-helmintic resistance. This is when the worms that affect a sheep start to develop a natural resistance and start to mutate to no longer be controlled by dewormers. There's a very real chance that in the next several years that all the chemical dewormers will no longer work, and the only sheep that will survive will be those that are parasite resistant. So before we look at the scientific study, let's look at some parasite resistant sheep breeds. The Barbados Blackbelly is a sheep found on the island of Barbados in the Caribbean, and it's 100% parasite resistant. It doesn't need any chemical dewormers to survive. It's a hair sheep. It arrived in Barbados about 1650 AD. It's originally from West Africa, and so it's had about 350 years on the island of Barbados and longer to develop its parasite resistance. The next is the Florida cracker or Florida native sheep. It is a wool sheep. It has kind of coarse wool that's not as marketable, but is 100% parasite resistant. It was brought into the state of Florida in the 1500s by the Spanish. The next is the Gulf Coast native sheep. It has a finer wool than the Florida cracker sheep. Thousands of these sheep lived in the southeast United States, and they supplied all the wool that came out of the southeast United States before the 1950s. In the 1950s, they were replaced by chemically dependent sheep as chemical dewormers came out and made other breeds more attractive for the southeast United States. Another breed is the St. Croix sheep. It came to the island of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean in the 1500s. Like the other sheep, it is 100% parasite resistant and does not require chemical dewormers to survive. Another parasite resistant sheep is the red Maasai sheep from Kenya. It's a hair sheep. It's also a fat tail sheep. A fat tail sheep is a meat sheep that has lumps of fat on its rear. The Dorper sheep breed is also derived from a fat-tailed sheep. The problem with red Maasai sheep is that they are nearly impossible to find. I've only found one place in Tanzania where you can even find these sheep. One other thing that all parasite-resistant sheep have in common is that they are nearly immune to foot rot, as they were developed over the centuries in areas with high amounts of humidity. Foot rot is a real problem in the southeast and areas with a lot of rainfall, and that's one thing you're not going to have to worry about if you have parasite-resistant sheep. So the only sheep I've found to be 100% parasite-resistant are the Barbados Blackbelly, Florida Cracker, Gulf Coast Native, St. Croix, and Red Maasai sheep. So let's talk about the somewhat parasite-resistant sheep breeds, which would be the Katahdin and the Royal White, which are both crosses of the St. Croix sheep. The Katahdin is a very recent breed. It was developed in Maine in the 1950s by crossing a St. Croix with a Wiltshire horn. It has half the parasite resistance of the St. Croix, but has a larger body size because of its Wiltshire horn ancestry. The Katahdin are good sheep, but they're just not quite as parasite resistant as the St. Croix and other breeds. Now, there are exceptions, but usually you have to deworm these sheep occasionally, not as much as regular sheep. They also seem to have more foot problems than the St. Croix do. The other somewhat parasite-resistant sheep is the Royal White sheep, which is a cross between a St. Croix sheep and a white Dorper. A few years ago, I purchased a Royal White lamb that was registered, and it made it about 6 months before it died from worms on my property. So let's talk about the Dorper sheep, which has very little parasite resistance. The Dorper is a beautiful sheep. It's very large, makes a lot of meat, it grows fast, and it's perfect for areas with low rainfall and without a large parasite problem. The Dorper is a newer sheep breed. It originated in the deserts of South Africa in the 1930s. The Dorper is a cross between the Dorset horned sheep from England, which has almost no parasite resistance, and the black-head Persian sheep from Somalia. It's not from Persia, it's from Somalia, It also has no parasite resistance because it was developed in the desert of Somalia. The black-head Persian is a fat-tailed sheep, which explains why the Dorper has such a larger body size. But it's not parasite resistant. But it does make you wonder if you could cross a red Maasai sheep, which is a fat-tailed sheep, with a St. Croix sheep. These are two of the most parasite-resistant sheep in the world. Then you would have something kind of close to a Dorper that would be totally parasite-resistant. That might be the answer. That's just an idea for you. So let's go ahead and start looking at the scientific comparison of these different sheep breeds. I found this study on the International Registry for Barbados Blackbelly and American Blackbelly sheep. And if you'll click on the link over to the left that says About the Sheep, it will open up a link that says Articles. When you click on the Articles link in the left column, it'll open up a list of all the different articles. This site is truly an amazing resource. If you'll scroll down the list, you'll come to the Health and Disease section, and in that you'll see an article that says Resistance to Internal Parasites in Lambs of Hair Sheep Composite Breeds. This article was written by David R. Notter from Virginia Tech, and they do a lot of good research at Virginia Tech on sheep. In this article on Table 2, they break it out into the mean body weight or average body weight, the average fecal egg count or FEC, and the average PVC, which is the packed cell volume. That's how many red blood cells and how much oxygen is being carried inside the animal. There are 4 breed types or groups. DO is Dorset horn, DP is Dorper, KT is Katahdin, and HH is a combination of Barbados Blackbelly and St. Croix sheep. If you look, the HH group of the St. Croix and Barbados Blackbelly, HH just means hair sheep, they have a smaller body weight than the other breeds, which is understandable, but their fecal egg count is about half that of the Katahdin and maybe 1/4 that of the Dorper and the Dorset. So these results came from a master's thesis written at Virginia Tech, which David Notter was the chairman of. And I'll put a link below to this thesis for you to look at. This thesis also has links to other studies that have been done earlier. This study that it's referencing deals with the Florida native sheep and how much better they are at repulsing parasites than like the Rambouillet. It also talks about the mechanism of how these sheep are able to repel these parasites, which I found very interesting. The master's thesis also quotes this study by Courtney in 1985, and it talks about how St. Croix lambs were more resistant than the domestic crossbred lambs like Fen sheep, Suffolk, Dorset. It's also suggesting that the St. Croix lambs are a little bit more resistant than the Florida native Barbados Blackbelly or a St. Croix that's 3/4 St. Croix and something else. This reference study talks about how St. Croix is not that much different from Dorset lambs when they're only like 8 weeks old. But once they get to about 14 weeks of age, the St. Croix had much fewer eggs than the Dorset. So in reading between the lines, this is telling me a really good reason for winter lambing, because they need about 14 weeks before they can really get their parasite resistance going. Another quote from this master's thesis is the work of Preston and Alomby in 1978, and it talks about how the red Maasai sheep are very parasite resistant and how they outclass the other sheep. What I found interesting is that the red Maasai, when they're crossed with the Dorper ewes, they became just as susceptible as the Dorpers at most sampling times. So sometimes when you cross a very parasite-resistant sheep with a non-parasite-resistant sheep, you're not going to get what you want out of it. And here's the chart that David Notter quoted from the graduate paper. It's a bar graph with DO standing for Dorset, DP for Dorper, KT for Katahdin, and HH for a cross between Barbados Blackbelly and St. Croix. HH is just hair sheep. The top graph is the body weight. BW is the body weight, and you can see how these other breeds, they just weigh more and they grow faster, than the hair sheep or the Katahdin even. So the Dorset and the Dorper are much superior in that way. For the fecal egg counts, the hair sheep are about half that of the Katahdin and quite a bit less than the Dorper or Dorset. I found it interesting that the Dorper had even a higher level of infection with the fecal egg count than even the Dorset did. So apparently because it was derived from sheep that grew up in the desert, it has a real problem with parasites. The bottom graph is the packed cell volume percentage, and that's really telling you how many red blood cells they have and how much oxygen they can deliver to the rest of their body. And you see as the time goes on, the hair sheep are doing great while the Dorper is actually coming in last on a lot of this. And so I'm going to end up this video by talking about the Gulf Coast native sheep, because the history of this sheep kind of tells you how we got to this point in the sheep industry. If you read the article on Wikipedia about the Gulf Coast native sheep, you'll see that there were thousands of these sheep all over the South, and they were a very important livestock breed for us here. And by the end of the 20th century, the Gulf Coast native sheep supplied nearly all the raw wool for the southern United States, and hundreds of thousands of them were in existence. However, post-World War II, deworming medications and other advances were widely introduced to the sheep industry in the United States, meaning that more modern breeds with greater production capacity could be introduced in the South. This led to the decline of the Gulf Coast native sheep. With anthelmintic resistance and the fact that these dewormers are no longer working like they used to, and at some point they're all going to fail. At some point we're going to come back and we're going to be looking for these types of sheep that are parasite resistant naturally. And the other characteristic of the Gulf Coast native is that it is especially known for its ability to resist foot rot, as well as the Haemachus contortus, which is the barber pole worm. So the points that we made with this scientific study is that the St. Croix and Barbados blackbelly have at least twice the parasite resistance of the Katahdin sheep. And the Katahdin sheep has twice the resistance of the Dorper sheep, with the Dorper having lower resistance than even like the Dorset horn sheep, which is an English breed. A lot of people will tell you that Katahdin and St. Croix, they're both parasite resistant. Well, it's not true. Katahdin's a little bit less. Now, you can find Katahdin that won't have a problem with parasites. It depends on where you live. If you live in a lower parasite area, then yeah, Katahdin can work for you just fine. But if you live in a place like Tennessee where we have a lot of parasites, you're going to have to worm your Katahdin to make sure they work. Thanks for watching the video.